thank you, everybody, for the great welcome we got and for several honors that have been bestowed on us this evening. And it was a great surprise, and we're very grateful. And I see a lot of old friends and a few new friends. I see some friends from Meadow Ridge. I think Lauren said we've been in Wilton 53 years. Well, not exactly. We live up at Meadow Ridge now for the past 8 years, but I still spend, at least 3 or 4 days a week down in Wilton doing things for the Wilton Library, the Wilton Historical Society, and various other groups, organizations, and the Wilton Library book sale, of course, which I still participate in, although I've got some great helpers that I hope will take the whole thing over soon. So they asked me to give a talk about 300 years of Wilton history in half an hour. So I said, well, we'll just talk about some people. And every time I say something with a P, it makes that thing pop. So I have to avoid words with a P in them, I guess. Okay, so I've chosen a number of very significant Wilton people, and we'll go through that sequentially, slide by slide. I have to thank Julie Hughes, who put the slides together for me, the PowerPoint presentation. We've checked it out, and it works out fine, and I hope they're able to see it on Zoom as well as personally. Okay, we're going to start off. That's the title slide. Then we'll start off with some other historians in our history. David Van Hooser on the left was a fourth-generation Wiltonian. His great-grandfather moved here after the Revolution. His grandfather was born here. His father was born here. He was born here in the 1860s, and he lived till 1920. But the advantage he had was 2 generations before him who had lived in Wilton for a very long time. So he wrote a lot of history based on recollections of his father and his grandfather. And in the center, we have Evans Hubbard, who was a lawyer, moved to Wilton in 1929, spent most of his time here shopping around for bits and pieces of Wilton history, built up quite a library of Wilton history, also acquired real estate in Wilton Center. He was the one who built Wilton Arms after World War II, and he wrote a lot of history. And there are 4 volumes of Hubbard's writings up in the history room, about the same number, 4 or 5 volumes of Van Hooser's writings. And on the right, we have Claire Ogden, for whom Ogden House is named. And he wrote a lot of folksy stories about people that he knew in his period that he lived in Wilton, starting in the early 1900s, right up to 1971. By that time, he'd moved to Florida, but he was still writing about Wilton people, articles in the Wilton Bulletin. So we can go on to the next one. This is the Lambert House you'll recognize. David Lambert came from a family with money. His 2 older sisters had married men who settled in Wilton, and since his father had just died recently and David had inherited a bundle of money, he got married, moved to Wilton, built this house in 1726 or 27. We're not exactly sure which. And it wasn't as big then as it is now. But as the family grew over the years, additions got added to the house. He had 3 children. His son, David Jr., was educated at Yale. Back then, they all went to Yale if they wanted a college education. And he had 2 daughters who married patriots who fought on the side of the American Revolution against the British. His son, David, was a businessman, did a lot of trading between America and England, and so he wasn't really patriotic. He was more sympathetic to the British. And he inherited the house. The 2 daughters married and lived elsewhere. So David Jr. inherited the house. And during the Revolution, he was more or less ostracized because he wasn't totally supporting the British, but he was leaning that way. But after the war, they accepted him back, as they did to many people who had been loyalists and then turned around and adopted the United States environment. The house, of course, now belongs to the Wilton Historical Society since 1964, and I'll get into more of that later. Okay, during the Revolution, one of the most interesting things that happened was the tearing down of the King George statue that stood down at the bottom tip of Manhattan. And it had been built in 1770, and by the time of the Declaration of Independence, people were getting tired of looking at King George sitting on that statue, and they realized it was all lead, and lead is what they used in bullets. So when the Declaration of Independence, it was July 4th when it was released, it was July 9th by the time the news got to New York City, and they read that news, and about 40 patriots swung a rope over it and pulled it down, cut it up into pieces, shipped it up to Litchfield to be made into bullets. Well, the way it got to Litchfield was by boat to Norwalk and by horse and buggy up Route 7, which wasn't Route 7 back then, but it was the way to get up to Litchfield. And they stopped overnight at the Raymond Tavern, which is now the old building at the top end of the Historical Society complex. And it's been moved there in 2001. That was a very interesting move, I have to say. A big old house with a solid stone chimney was moved in one piece. So I took off the next morning after staying overnight, went on up to Litchfield, made 42,066 bullets, some number like that. And the reason it was so precise is a young man in the family recorded the number, and it was published that way. But what they didn't figure at the time was that it should have made almost twice as many bullets because it was a 4,000-pound statue. And it wasn't until 50 years later that the people in Wilton started pulling up pieces of strange lead shapes out of the ground, the farmland. And they it was exactly 50 years later, 1826, when they found the first piece. And over the years, during the 19th century, they pulled many of these pieces out of the ground. And this little drawing shows you in black the pieces that have been identified. And a lot of the white is either still missing, and or maybe it was actually melted down, because lead is what the plumbers used too. So some of it may still be in the ground around here. One place where they found a number of pieces was what is now called Crown Pond, and because it was convenient to the tavern where they stayed overnight. And then up the road a little ways, there's a big swamp just north of Wilton Commons. And the swamp's been there forever, and they found several pieces up there too. The last piece they found, in 1972, a man found a piece and sold it to a museum in New York City, and then found he had sold something he didn't own because he'd got it off of land without permission of the owner of the land. So there was a great lawsuit. The owner got possession of it, sold it to the same museum. Now, just recently, 2.5 years ago, in November of 2019, a piece of the statue came up on auctions. And so the Wilton Historical Society said, well, we should buy that. And it was a piece of the left arm, about this much of the left arm, and hand and wrist. And the bidding started at something like $20,000. And it got up to $160,000. And the Wilton Historical Society says, we can't do it. So somebody else got it. We don't know who. Okay, we're going to talk about a couple of very interesting men who happen to be cousins, distant cousins. Moses Stewart and then William Stewart. Moses was a scholar, a very bright man, perhaps the brightest most intelligent person we ever sent through the school system. And after getting his degree from Yale, he had a law degree and a religion degree. He preached in a church in New Haven, and then he chose to do academic research at Andover, Massachusetts Seminary. Spent 40 years there, wrote a number of books, 2 of them about the apocalypse, which should probably be good reading today, except it's pretty hard to read. Okay, and then we'll go on to William Stewart, and we have a copy of his book that's available to take out at the Wilton Library. He was a counterfeiter, the Connecticut's first counterfeiter, and he was a nasty guy from a boyhood through young manhood up until the time, many years later, when he was in his 60s, he wrote this little book. And as a kid, he got into all kinds of trouble. He was constantly being whipped either at school or by his father. And he did things like putting a chicken into a churn and tarred and feathered a cow, and he would dull an axe on a stone just out of spite, and just a nasty guy. And in his book, he describes how when he got to age 14, he found that all the other 14-year-olds were going down to Norwalk or out to Fairfield and drink in the saloons, and he said every kid of 14 drank regularly back in those days. It was easy to get. And in one of those encounters, a man offered him some counterfeit bills. And back then there was no standard currency, so you didn't really know if it was real or not. And so he bought a number of these counterfeit bills and passed them off as real, and decided this was a good deal. He found out where he could get them up in Canada, and he, on horseback, went up there, got more counterfeit bills, sold them around all along the East Coast, as far down as Georgia. Did this for 14 years until they finally caught up with him, and they sent him to the famous Newgate prison. And you may have visited it. It's up in East Granby at the top end of Connecticut. It was an ugly place, an underground prison in an old cave. And he spent 8 years there, harassing the other prisoners and harassing the guards. And he finally got released, and then many years later, he wrote his book. Don't know why, but I think it was meant to be a lesson of don't be like me. Okay, now we move on to more academics. A man named Holly Olmsted. His grandfather was in the Revolution, was killed in the Revolution before his mother was born. And his mother married her mother's last name was Hawley, and she married an Olmsted. And so she named her son Holly Olmsted. And he also went to Yale. And he decided we needed an academy here to train young people so they could get into the colleges and get better education. So he set up the academy in about 1815, 1816. And there's a complete record, as far as we know, of all the students that attended this academy. It was very interesting. A number of them went on to be congressmen, or at least in the Connecticut legislature. One of them became a Connecticut governor. A lot of them had gone on from this training for college and gone on to get advanced degrees. And so it was very successful all through the 19th century, up until Holly's son Edward died in 1898. So it lasted almost through that century. We can go on to the next. His son was Edward, and he married Marion, and Marion is the older lady in this picture. Edward Olmsted's in the front row, and those are their children. Marion turned out to be quite a historian herself. She wrote the history of the Wilton Academy, all the list of all the students that went to the Wilton Academy. She wrote about the Congregational Church. She wrote about old houses in Wilton and a couple other things. So she, on her own, was a historian, the first female historian that we knew of in Wilton. And the young woman on the far left in the back, Anne, married a Merwin, and she was the mother of Tim Merwin, who comes up later in this presentation. Okay. Now, we get into the 1830 period, and abolition was beginning to take hold in New England. And William Wakeman was the president of the Anti-Slavery Society. He lived on Cannon Road in the house not Cannon Road, it's Sealy Road, where it makes the turn. If you go off Route 7 or across the tracks, and you go over and make a sharp left turn, it's up on the hill to the left. A house is still there. It's lived in, and there's a lot of greenery around it now. It doesn't look like this anymore. But the main event that got the anti-slavery activity going, they had a preacher who traveled the state making anti-slave lectures, and he lectured up in the Baptist church in Georgetown for 3 nights in a row in November of whatever year that was, 1838. Reverend Nathaniel Culver, and he's Baptist church. He's lectured 3 nights in a row, and each time there was a crowd of protesters, which kept getting larger and larger. These protesters were mainly from Danbury because they thought that the anti-slavery movement would hurt their business with the South. They made a lot of hats in Danbury, and they didn't want to, slow down their business with the South. And so they protested, and it got worse, and it got worse. And then the ultimate end of this is after the last lecture, somebody unknown placed a barrel of gunpowder under the pulpit in the church and blew it up. And so the church was destroyed, but not the Anti-Slavery Society. William Wakeman survived several more years. He maintained a station on the Underground Railroad, transporting slaves from the South on, to his place and then on up to another place. Okay, now we get into the period of the railroad. Charles Cannon was the 3rd Cannon in that family that lived up in in Cannondale. That's how it got its name. And his grandfather had put a store in up there. The George Cannon store has now been moved down to the Lambert property. It's one of the buildings that the Wilton Historical Society owns on the Lambert property. And Charles had his own little business too. And when the railroad came through Wilton, it was a big deal. The state wanted to get rails running through all the major locations, and there was no connection between Danbury and Norwalk. So, excuse me. So they got the line. They had surveyors draw the line that the railroad had to follow through Wilton. $16,000 was the cost of the entire right-of-way through Wilton, 7 miles long. And the owners of the property, felt cheated, but they didn't have any recluse. There wasn't any way out. And they had to allow the train to be built, the rails to be built. And at first they thought this was some residents thought this was a great improvement. They could get their produce down to New York City very rapidly on the train and sell things at better prices than they could get locally. But then the young people in town realized if they wanted their own land, they had to go somewhere else because in the time of large families, anything below the eldest son was going to take a much smaller piece of the property when the family passed on. So a lot of these younger people got on the train and went out west. And especially after the Homestead Act was passed in 1862, where they gave free land to people, a lot of those young people left Wilton. So the second half of the 1800s, Wilton was pretty stagnant. The young people were all moving somewhere else. There were no big new houses being built in the second half of the 1800s, and the population stabilized from about 1860 to 1900 before other things happened that started to make it grow again. Cannon's role in this is that he had bought the right to supervise the construction of a mile of those 7 miles through Wilton. And so he hired mainly Irishmen who were looking for jobs anyhow, and they were good workers, and so he managed that construction of that mile. And of course, they let him name his little community Cannondale. That's how it became Cannondale. Okay, now there's this man was a real entrepreneur, Dr. J. Edward Turner, and he was a doctor, had trained in Europe. His specialty was treating alcoholism, and he found out how they did it in Europe. Total abstention was the only way to cure people. And the person had to be somewhat willing to go through this, but total abstention was the way to go. And so he came back, and he had a place in Binghamton, New York, and he was practicing his total abstention. And the new board of directors didn't think that was fair. They said, well, these poor people, can't they have a glass of wine before dinner and treat them a little softer? And he said, no, it's got to be this way or nothing. So they fired him. So he came back to Wilton, and I say back to Wilton because his wife was from Wilton. And fortunately, she was from a very large family, the Middlebrooks. And we have Middlebrook Road, we have Middlebrook School, we have Middlebrook this and that. And they had come to Wilton very early in the 1740s and 50s and bought a lot of the land, like everything between Ridgefield Road and Danbury Road up there was Middlebrook land. And so there was a large family of Middlebrooks that were willing to support Dr. Turner in his plan because he said, I will build this for treating women alcoholics. And that's what this was going to be. It was going to be up at the top of Middlebrook Farm Road where Turner Ridge Road comes in from the other side. And it was all cleared land back then, beautiful location. And he traveled around the state raising money, wrote a book, which we have in the Wilton History Room Library. That's where I got this picture. And raised money by selling his book and advertising the values of this way to treat alcoholics. And they had actually a groundbreaking in 1888 or thereabouts. And then the state of Connecticut had been influenced by the state of New York, who had said this man is a fake, and you shouldn't let him build a hospital in Wilton. And so they revoked his license. So the poor man had to go home. His home was in the house that we call the Schlichting House that was on Ridgefield Road, just torn down about 3 or 4 years ago. And he went back there and died a very unhappy man in 1889. But 20 years later, 1909, the Medical Association erected a monument on his grave up at Hillside, and it says, in honor of Dr. J. Edward Turner, founder of the modern way to treat alcoholism, and a few other things. And by then, there were 40 or 50 other hospitals treating the alcoholics the way Dr. Turner was going to do it. He never got a chance to build this hospital, though. Okay, now we're up to some more Lamberts. The old gentleman on the left was a grandson of the original David Lambert. That's Samuel. And Samuel was a businessman in New York City, had a number of romances, but nothing stuck, and so he moved back to Wilton, and he married the daughter of the landscape man, and daughter of the landscape man who lived across the street. And they had one child, and that poor guy in the middle is David Samuel Rogers Lambert as a child. And the old man was in his 70s when his son was born. He didn't live much longer. But David S.R. Lambert grew up opened his own private academy in the Lambert House, and he, by then, was the last of the Lamberts. The Samuel's brothers and sisters had all died, except for one who lived in Canada, who fortunately had married a wealthy Canadian, so there was still some connection to keep them alive here in Wilton. And they needed money, they called their uncle in Canada. But David S.R. grew up and married an Ogden, Eva Ogden, who was a poet. And in 1898, two men showed up at the door and demanded money and silver. They said, "We know you have money in this house, we want it." Well, David wasn't home. Eva said, "David's not home." And so they drugged her, tied her up, waited for David to come home. David came home, there was a scuffle, he was shot. He didn't die immediately. He lasted 5 more days, but he died. Wow, this was a big deal. You know, the wealthiest family in Wilton, the last survivor of the Lambert family, is killed by intruders. So what are we going to do? Well, it got into the New York Times. It got into all the newspapers that covered this area. And so the Lambert family hired the Pinkerton detectives. And we have a photograph of a number of the well-dressed Pinkertons standing on the porch of the Lambert House, the porch that we all use when we have a tour of the Lambert property. And the Pinkertons tracked down the two men that were in this attack. They were both former students of David S.R. Lambert. And one of them was unhappy with the way he had been treated as a student. So as a revenge, he thought he'd come back and take all their money. Well, ends up the two of them escaped by train. The Pinkertons tracked them down, one in one in Cincinnati and another in Chicago. Tracked them both down, brought them back here. They were tried, sentenced to death. And poor Eva lived on for another 20 years in the house, and then eventually sold it to Ruth Kellogg, a single lady, and her brother. Ruth Kellogg lasted longer than the brother. And then in the early 60s, 1960s, the Wilton Historical Society was looking for a home. They had lived in or held meetings in various places, but they found that the Lambert property might be available. And it, of course, was the oldest house in Wilton, still is, that's still standing from its original date. And, but the price was too high. But thank heavens to Estelle Reimer, one of the leaders of the Wilton Historical Society at the time, who managed to pull it all together and work out a deal where the Historical Society got it in 1964. Ellen Schofield Betts. Now we're into Wilton Library history. Ellen Betts and her husband moved into this nice house down on Route 7 on Danbury Road. Beautiful old mansion. It was just south of Lady of Fatima. There's an ugly office building there now. Excuse me. But when we moved to Wilton, it was a furniture company in that house. And it survived for a while after the last residents had moved out. Ellen Betts came from New York City, and she was accustomed to having a library. Well, they didn't have a library in Wilton, so she thought we have to organize to get a library going. And she was really the instigation for a committee that was formed to create the Wilton Library in 1895. The actual meeting that organized the library was in a little house owned by Henry Thompson, an artist. And that house is still here, believe it or not. It's the front end of Wilton Arms. If you drive around the bank and you look to the right, you can see the shape of an old house on which was built the Wilton Arms in 1946. Evans Hubbard built it as a home or a place for returning veterans to live. But he had them save the old house and then build onto the back of it, the Wilton Arms. So you can always drive up there and say, here's where the Wilton Library was organized, in this house, which is still there. But most people don't even recognize it as a house. Ah, Anna Carpenter. This old lady lived to be 99 3/4. She lived in one of the houses on Cottage Row. Well, now Cottage Row is mostly rebuilt now, but if you start at the village market and look south, you can see the shell of a couple of old houses along there, and with things that have been built onto them. Well, Anna Carpenter was one of that was torn down completely. It was more or less across from the Wilton Library, and she was from Darien, and I do have her date of birth, 1833. She was actually part of the Underground Railroad operation in Darien when she was young, and she was a trained botanist, and she submitted her first, to look up the date, submitted her first specimen to Yale in 1853. And in Wilton, she came to Wilton in 1892, and she assembled a herbarium collection of over 1,000 specimens, just based on her knowledge and finding them around here growing wild in the area. She donated over 200 sheets of the flowers to the Wilton Library for the collection that's up in the history room. The collection was added onto by Mary Beth Wheeler and others, but the rest of this collection of 1,000 sheets, about 800 of them went to the Peabody Museum in New Haven. But she was quite a person. She used to, we weren't around, of course, in 1933, the year she died, but she used to give walks for the young kids and through the woods, and you can imagine all the wildflowers that were there a long time ago that aren't there anymore. Okay. Now we get into really interesting Grace Shank. She was the mover and shaker that got things started in the community in Wilton. Let me see where I am. She and her husband, Ernest, bought the Solomon Pigeon Farm, which was just south of Cottage Row. And back then, you went down Old Ridgefield Road and across a bridge and up and connected onto Danbury Road. Well, you know, that bridge was closed down in 1940 when they built the new bridge and cut off the access. They tried to eliminate as many grade crossings as they could. But the Shank family bought this old pigeon farm that had been down at the end of the Wilton Center area, built a wonderful home. Ernest was a diamond merchant. He took the train into New York City every day. Didn't do anything in the community, but Grace was the community person. She was really our first community leader. She organized the first women's suffrage movement in Wilton. She organized the Civic League, the local Red Cross chapter, the public health nursing, which became nursing and home care. She led the Women's Land Army during World War I, which was training women to take care of the fields because the men were off fighting in the war. And she was a charter member of the Wilton Garden Club. She got the women's right to vote on school issues well before 1920 because the state had passed a law in 1893 that allowed women to vote on school issues. But the town of Wilton hadn't bothered to implement it. But Grace took care of that. So the women could now vote on school issues. She raised 3 children, all of whom had successful lives. Her grandson, Phil Shank, who is a friend of ours, comes to Wilton frequently. He was town manager at Avon and then at Bloomfield for many years, and he's still active in state affairs. Grace, unfortunately, died young from cancer in 1932, before her grandson Phil was even born. Ernest lived on in that house until 1955. When he died, the property was changed, rezoned for commercial. That's where Stop and Shop is now. But If you go down there, you'll see there's an old stone fence with an iron gate, and that was part of the Shank property. That was the entrance to the Shank property. The old house stood up there. If you drive in the driveway headed towards Stop and Shop, the old house was on the right. And apparently it was a lovely house with a big backyard, and they had a lot of social events there. And it was the life of the community way back then. But thank heavens the gate and the stone wall are preserved. And of course there's Shank's Island, and that was their farmland. They used to, grow the hay there and haul it over to the barn for the animals. We have Angie Post. Angie was one of the last teachers in the one-room schools, and she taught 45 years in Wilton in one-room schools. Hurlbut Street School closed in 1935, and Angie was there when they closed it. And then they moved her over to Center School, and she taught there for a few more years, a total of 45. You can easily see who's Angie in that picture. The men on the left were part of the school board, and the woman on the right was the artist who drew that portrait, and nobody knows whatever happened to that portrait. Okay, next we have Tim Merwin. Tim Merwin, everybody remembers Merwin Meadows. They remember there was a man that owned Merwin Meadows. It's now the swimming hole. And his name was Timothy II. And he had a couple of sons, one of whom was a great photographer. We had our kids' pictures taken by, was it Gus Merwin was the son, who was the photographer. Tim made his main contribution to Wilton was he was very, very interested in the schools. And he was on the school board for the town of Wilton when we still had one-room schools in 1927 and 1929. And then Center School got built about 1930, and he continued to be active. He was a PTA president starting in 1933. In 1937, he strongly opposed Wilton joining a regional school plan because he said in a few years we're going to need our own. And then there was another effort a few years later, like 1944, they tried to organize to have a regional school. And again, he refused. And then he took a option on the 65-acre Harbs family property because the town hadn't come up with the money to buy it. And that is where the cider mill school and the Comstock school, which has since been converted to town use, were both built on the Harbs property. Because after World War II, the town came up with the money to buy the property. Tim had taken the option before, in 1940, before World War II. He also was a founder of the fire department in 1928, the YMCA branch in Wilton, and the Wilton Play Shop. He was a great singer, and he was always in the minstrel shows that the fire department used to have. The kind of thing you can't do anymore. And some of his family still live in Wilton. Okay, we'll go on to the Meyer brothers. Does anybody remember that old building? Yes, those of you that grew up here and have been here a long time. They tore the building down about 2 years after we moved to Wilton. It was down on Wolf Pit Road at the river. And the Meyer brothers started in the early 1900s. They were great builders. They learned from George Taylor, who was a builder before them. They learned the skill of building homes and buildings, and they built the Center School. They built the old Wilton Library. They built the American Legion Hall, a number of other buildings around town. And then they built this huge woodworking shop down there on the riverbank, which was a beautiful place, and they made fine woodworking products in there. But then the state, of course, in its plan for Super 7, took 100 properties in that period of 1969, 1970, and they tore down the mill. So that was the end of that. Okay. Oh, these guys were real enterprisers. This is a company called Angelique Perfume Company that was located on the second floor of what we now call the CVS building. And you can see they've got their foot out onto the roof, and they're setting up a spray to spray their perfume scent over downtown Wilton. They did this in several places. They tried to dye the waters of the river at Niagara Falls, but they were prevented from doing that. They got to Paris, and they put dry ice that had been flavored in perfume into the clouds so they could spread the aroma through Paris. Real enterprisers. And they had about 40 women, mostly, filling bottles with various flavors of their perfume in this little space upstairs over CVS. And then they got interviewed. Want to hold that up, Julie? Julie, they got interviewed by Life magazine. And Julie will show you. This is in December of 1950. They made it to Life magazine. Big article about the enterprising Granville and Swarthout. It was kind of jokingly called the Skunk Works because one of these men lived on Skunk Lane. And there are still people in town who work there. Nia? Nia worked there. Filled bottles. Filled bottles. Did they give you any? Anyhow, after the article appeared in Life magazine, you can imagine their business boomed. And at one point, they had 60 or 70 women in there filling these bottles after December 1950. And they had to move to a larger space. Wasn't enough there. They've got a space down on Route 7, kind of across from the Historical Society, across from the Lambert House, and a little bit farther south. And even that wasn't enough. And so they were in the midst of looking for more space, and then they got an offer, a buyout offer, from Hazel Bishop. And Hazel Bishop obviously wanted to put them out of business. So they bought the Angelique, and they immediately put them out of business. And the two men moved on to other careers. But it was, I guess, fun while it lasted. Okay. Now we're back to the Wilton Library again. They realized in 1973 or thereabouts that the little old library wasn't big enough, and we had to have a new building. And Virginia Adams, Tom Adams' wife, was chairman of the library board, president of the Library Association, and they worked out a deal. The building that we're standing or sitting in tonight was on a vacant lot that had once been a nice old house, but it was torn down. It was owned by a bank. And then next to the north, which is now a parking lot, was the home of Dr. Gorham. Dr. Gorham was next door in a big old house, and there's a picture of that big old house in the book. When the doctor died earlier than his wife. When the wife died, she left that house to the town of Wilton for municipal use. And so for several years, it served as a kindergarten for the town of Wilton. And then it served as a storage place for the overflow books from the library, which was up there where the bank is now. So we had these three properties, an empty lot, the Gorham House, and the library that was too small. So she worked out a swap with a library. The library was going to get this space. We got this space, and we got the Gorham House, and the bank which owned this property got what used to be the library. And it's now where the bank is now. And they had originally said, well, we'll just use the old library building, turn it into a bank. Well, it took them about a year to decide that one didn't work, so they tore down and built their own bank building. And so there's no evidence of the 1918 bank up there anymore. Walt Smith. Walt Smith learned his building skills from the Meyer brothers, who had in turn learned it from, was it Charlie Abbott? No, it wasn't Abbott. Well, whatever. But Walt Smith had been in World War II, and after the war, his ancestors were, a lot of them from Wilton. He had grown up in Stamford, and he came back here and joined his father's business in Wilton, and his father died, like within 6 months. And so Walt, at age whatever, he was in his 20s when he inherited the family business. And so he kept the business going for about 60 years. But he quickly got attached to old buildings and the construction methods and the preservation of old buildings. He worked on the Lambert House when Ruth Kellogg lived there in the 1950s. And he worked on many of the old houses in town. And he had enough college training and enough skill that he could be his own architect and put these buildings together the way he knew they should be. And so I think at last count there are 17 buildings that the Historical Society owns that Walt Smith had a major role in moving and designing and setting them up or repairing them. And that was his major contribution to Wilton, is all the work he did for the Historical Society. Peggy Gill. She was one of our favorite first selectmen. And she was first selectman from 1981 to 1986. She served 2.5 two-year terms. She left in the middle of a term to be a state representative at Hartford. And she, in her time in Wilton, accomplished an awful lot because the road through Wilton was dead end ever since 1940 when they built the bridge up above and they closed the grade crossings. You could get down Ridgefield Road, Old Ridgefield Road, only so far. And you could drive down a little farther because Ogden House had been built, but then it didn't go all the way down to Horseshoe Road. Well, Peggy got that done. She got the road built through to Horseshoe Road. She also convinced the school to move their offices out of the old center school. It had not been used as a school since 1971, but she convinced them to move up into space in the area of the new high school building, in the front building where the offices are now. And so she turned the center school into commercial offices. And she also took one of the wings off to make more room around the building and added on all those buildings in back of the center school. She had them build, where the restaurants are, 4 restaurants and a bank. And then she got the post office to move out of Post Office Square over there onto Hubbard Road. And a number of other things that Peggy accomplished. She got the new back door added onto Town Hall. Used to have to go in the front door. And she converted the old Public Works garage to the Town Hall Annex. She strongly supported the building of Wilton Meadows. But then she didn't get the seal out of this because she died young at age 53 in 1994. But she was a mover and shaker and got a lot done. Oh, well, this is Helen Martin. She was our favorite school principal. She came to Wilton in about 1968 as, I think, principal at the Gilbert and Bennett School, which by end of 1971 term, Gilbert and Bennett School was closed because the new high school had opened and there was a lot of shuffling of grades here and there, but they closed Center School and Gilbert and Bennett at the end of the 1970-71 term. And so Helen had moved by then down to Driscoll School. where she was principal until she retired, which was about the year 2000, moved to Florida. But she was everybody's favorite principal. She never forgot the name of a student. And you could go in 12 years later and she'd say, "How are Jim and Jennifer doing?" You know, how does she remember all this? Wonderful woman. She just died this year in January, down in Florida. Okay, that handsome gentleman likes to say that he's the last Viking. This is Trygve on January 3rd this year. It was his 100th birthday. We had a little celebration for him. And he's still lively. He still goes down to the Jimmy's once or twice a week and has coffee with the old gang, which is getting smaller and smaller. And when he got to Wilton, I guess someone invited him to a football game, and so he went to this game, and he said, "What are they doing?" They're throwing this funny thing around. He says, "That's not football," because he thought he was seeing a soccer. He thought he was going to see a soccer game. Well, they didn't have soccer in Wilton. They didn't even know what it was. So he encouraged them to get soccer going in Wilton. And then on the next slide, we can see one of the products there, Christine Lilly. She's really our most famous athlete. She was so good in soccer that the U.S. national team in 1987 invited her to join the U.S. national team when she was still in high school. And then she went to North Carolina University, North Carolina, and they won 4 NCAA championships in the 4 years she was there. Then she joined on the U.S. Team for the World Cup, and they won the World Cup twice, and they won the Olympics twice. And she holds many records in the soccer, professional soccer organizations. She had more international playing games than any other man or woman in professional soccer. Okay, now, does everybody know what that is? Well, it's there on the side, the flag raising at Iwo Jima. And this is not in my book. I'm just cheating and adding some other things I think you ought to know. And if you were ever on a walking tour of the Hillside Cemetery, you heard me mention Joe Hopkins' name, because he was a commander of an LST boat which transported heavy equipment to Iwo Jima to support the Marines who were fighting the battle in February of 1945. And so after the Marines had succeeded to capture Mount Suribachi, they put up a flag that was so small that the rest of the Marines at the bottom of the hill couldn't even see it. And so they sent a Marine down to Joe's boat, and they came on and said, "We want the biggest flag that you have." And so he brought out this, I think it was like 6 by 9 foot flag that was folded up, and they took that up on top of Mount Suribachi. And so that's the one you see in all these pictures. And it's Joe Hopkins' flag. So in Wilton, he was a very quiet man. He was a member of the American Legion. He marched every year in the parade. You can find his picture in my book. When I have a picture of the parade, I forget what year it was. But he died in 1980. And the remains of the flag are now on display in the Marine Historical Museum in Washington, D.C. So, with apologies to all the many others that we couldn't work into this presentation, artists, authors, architects, actors, musicians, farmers, merchants, veterans, etc., all those people that we could not work into the presentation, I've just touched the tip of the iceberg here. There are many more. So thank you very much. we're going to do Q&A. Can I ask a question? No. No.
Can you talk a little bit about the Borglums?
The Borglums. Well, that comes in the category of artists and sculptors. In that category, if I talk about one, then I've got about 12 others I have to talk about. But Solon Borglum is the one that lived in Wilton. Some people think it was Gutzon Borglum who did the carving on the mountain out in Mount Rushmore. That was Solon's brother. Solon Borglum did smaller carvings, and he lived in Wilton. And his grandson, David Borglum, just died recently. David's daughter still lives in Wilton, Felicia. She volunteered to help with the Wilton Library book sale. And they lived on Borglum Road, of all places. And Felicia lives in the house that David used to live in. David had his own business. He was really into roofing. So when I was first selectman, we used David as a consultant on roofing. But he had memories of when he was young of one of the old mills that was on the Silvermine River that was still in operation. This is before the 55 flood. I didn't talk about the 55 flood. That's something else for another discussion. But the 55 flood pretty well wiped out that nice old mill that was down there on the Silvermine. And then Solon Borglum, a lot of his art's in a museum up in, what's the town in middle of Connecticut? I'll look it up, but you can find a lot of it. Yeah. Yeah, it might be New Britain. New Britain, I think. There's a lot of Solon Borglum stuff.
Yeah, I would just like to reminisce for a minute with you. I moved to Wilton in 1948 in the ABC house, and we asked our dad, how can we get to school? And he said, if you can't get there, I'll carry you there, because of course we went to Center School, which was right across the stone wall. I went to Gorham House as a kindergartner. As a teenager, I worked in the library, which was in the Bank of America, at that area. But as children, we would go over to Mr. Shank's property. He had a big barn there and a farmer named Mr. Husted, and we would feed the cats in his barn and everything. So it was really, really wonderful. And where Ogden House is, we used to call that the Pine Forest because the road didn't go on any farther. And I learned to swim in the Norwalk River.
Yeah.
Okay.
You didn't tell us your name.
Ann Gosley Jovovich.
Ann Gosley. And I think you were among the first graduates when Wilton High School opened as a high school.
Yeah, my brother had to go to Staples, and we graduated in '62, and I'm not sure whether that was the second or third. We're about to have our 60th reunion this fall.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Good. Thank you. One over here.
Hi, thank you. I had kind of two quick questions. You talked about artists or actors. I think, is Paul Dano from Wilton? He was in There Will Be Blood with Daniel Day-Lewis. Yeah, he's a great actor. And the second question is more historical. It maybe has to do more with the Battle of Richfield, but you know, I go fly fishing on the Saugatuck, and there's a memorial from where the British crossed to burn Danbury. But then Benedict Arnold forced them down Route 7, and that battle ensued. And it was really Benedict Arnold that, you know, the British never had an amphibious landing again. So I think it came down Route 7 into Wilton, and there's a cannonball in a house. Do you have any, did that extend down into Wilton?
The cannonballs in Ridgefield in a house.
Yeah, but does it come down?
Well, they came down after the Battle of Ridgefield. They came down Ridgefield Road.
Yeah.
And they stopped at a half a dozen houses on the way. to steal things.
Yeah.
And they got into a couple of arguments and shot one guy, didn't kill him. But then there were other people who were more cautious about the approach of the British, like the one woman who set the family table with food and dishes, and then she took the kids and went and hid in the woods. And so the Brits stopped there and ate the stuff and went on, didn't damage the house. At the end of all that, when we had become a state, and the state of Connecticut decided they would award people who had been suffered a loss to the British during the raid. And of course, a lot of those people lived down on the waterfronts in Stamford and Stamford, Westport, Norwalk. But the people in Wilton, whose houses had been invaded, put in claims for a certain amount to replace whatever they thought the value of what they thought they had lost. And it was about 8 or 10 Wilton people with claims. Well, that was fine, except the state didn't have any money to pay the claims. And so they gave them land. You've heard of the Western Reserve? Connecticut still owned this piece out in northern Ohio called the Western Reserve. And so they gave little pieces, a small section of a few acres to a number of these people as reward for the damage they suffered. But then they couldn't go collect because the state of Ohio is still filled with Indians. They gave this award like in 1795. It was 1803 before Ohio became a state, but it still had Indians in it. I had an ancestor that fought in the War of 1812, and his assignment was to go out in Ohio and chase the Indians out because they were still there in 1812. So it was quite a while before those people that got the rewards were able to claim them. And by then they had probably sold it to somebody else or forgotten about it. But up in northern Ohio, you've got Norwalk and Westport and other towns like that sound very much like Fairfield County.
Bob, we have an online question from one of our Zoomers. What are some of the ways in which Wilton has changed the most from its beginnings through today?
Well, we were a total country community in 1900, even in 1920, and pretty much so in 1940. And after the war, everything changed because the soldiers all came back and they got married. They wanted a place to live. They wanted their own property, a little piece. They didn't want a farmland. In fact, they didn't want to work on the farms. When we interviewed the old-timers in town, we talked to old-timers who couldn't find enough hired help to keep the farm going. But on the other hand, they had real estate people badgering them to sell their land. So that's what happened. In a period of about 20 years, it turned from farmland into suburb. The 20 years were like 1945 to 1965. Population boomed in that period. So that was the biggest single change, I think.
Bob, thank you for such an engaging presentation. This has been really remarkable, and your book, of course, all the more so. I have a question about Chief Chicken, or Chicken, however it's said. In your book, you describe him as having had a tract of land which he swapped with John Red, I believe, or who became, for whom Reading was named.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about how Chief Chicken came to get that land in the first place?
I don't know that we know. I researched as much as I could find. Julie, maybe you can find more about Chief Chicken, but anyhow, we knew he had come from somewhere along the shore, I think.
I think it was largely that he was part of the Native American group that had prior claim to the area, and he somehow became either a representative or an inheritor from his ancestors of that land.
But he was apparently an unsavory character. He had killed somebody in his previous residence, and so he came up to Reading area and established a home there, and used to come through Wilton to get down to Long Island Sound because he liked fish. and his path through Wilton was Chicken Street. Chicken Street ran all the way up what we now call Mountain Road to Georgetown. Somewhere in the 1950s, people decided they didn't want to live on Chicken Street, so they changed it to Mountain Road, except for those people that are still on Chicken Street.
Thank you, Bob.
And thank you for your endorsement in your column last week. Okay.
One other person, how about the Leatherman?
Well, that's one of the things I would have liked to talk about. I would have liked to talk about the Leatherman and the man who almost developed the huge farm up on top of, yeah, yeah. But anyhow, the Leatherman was, I'm pretty sure, from France, and he lived on the trail all the time. He had a favorite route through southwestern Connecticut. It took him 30 to 32 days to make this route. You go across this way and up a little, and then back across around Danbury, and maybe through some of New York State, and then back through Wilton. And they would recognize him because he always wore this same outfit of leather. And you've seen his pictures in my book, and there's some other things written about him. And there's some fictional stories of how he had to leave France because he had misused some of his employer's property, and they took his money away. And that's probably fiction. Nobody's quite sure how he got here. But he never spoke to anybody. And people would leave food out for him. He was a very pleasant man, and then he'd nod for the food and then go on his trail all the way around. He ended up dying over in New York State in Westchester County, and he's buried over there. And there's some books about him.
Yeah, I think I bought a book at the Wilton Historical Society. I showed it to my dad, and my dad I grew up in New Fairfield up on Canada Lake.
Yeah.
So my dad knew about it. Like people, the dad heard about him, even up there.
Yeah, yeah.
He made it up there, like around Danbury. So.
Oh yeah, he made this big loop. He went up his Danbury a little farther and over to New York State and down around through New Canaan, Wilton, a little bit of Norwalk, and back out east and back up again.
One more question, Bob, before we end the evening from our online chat. What was the most, what surprised you the most when you did your research for the book? Were there anything that you had no idea about? And
Oh, lots of things I
Okay.
had no idea about. In fact, the Daily News was no daily news reporting, but the Ridgefield Press started a weekly column on Wilton News in about 1878. And so I went up to Ridgefield and read all these things on microfilm. You know, every week there was something new that happened in happened in Wilton. And Ridgefield Press was a major source. The Norwalk papers were somewhat of a source, but not as good as the Ridgefield Press. And, you know, you could find tons of things about, well, when the trains started running, there were numerous train accidents. People killed at train crossings. Train man killed because he was riding on top of one of the train cars and they went under a bridge that was too low and killed him. And things like that. People losing limbs because they went to sleep on the train track. And the drunks would wander along and fall asleep on the train track, and the train would come along and run over them, and just all this kind of stuff.
This is why everyone in this room should contact either the Ridgefield Library or the Ridgefield Historical Society and tell them to digitize the Ridgefield Press.
Yeah, it's still not digitized, that's right.
Bob,
Bob, one more in-house question.
Yeah.
the many stone walls, did they mark property lines, or did they serve some other purpose, and when do you think they were
Well,
all built?
when they were built, they were marking property lines, generally, or divisions between farmland and the wild land. They want to keep the certain animals out of the vegetable garden, for example. Maybe it was within a property, but to a large extent, it marked property lines. And of course, we have stone walls everywhere. And the house we had in Wilton had beautiful old stone walls that didn't divide anything anymore.
Well,
Okay,
thank
thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for coming.